All right, we're honored to have Christian apologist Dr. Sean McDowell with us today. He's a renowned author, professor, and speaker, known for his ability to tackle tough theological issues with clarity and compassion. Today, we're diving into one of the most challenging topics in all of Christian thought, the problem of evil or suffering. How can an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing God allow suffering and evil in the world? It's a question that's troubled believers and skeptics alike for centuries, and Dr. McDowell's here to help us navigate this complex issue. Welcome. Thank you for being on with us today.
Oh, happy to do so. This is a treat.
Yeah, that's great. So can we just start off? Why is the problem of evil or suffering the problem?
Well, I think there's probably two reasons I can think of. One is that the problem of evil is not just intellectual. It's not just philosophical. It's experiential and it's emotional. It's not like solving a math problem in which you just line up all your ducks in a row and go, oh, I proved that next. And so because of the experience of it, we've seen evil. We've all contributed to evil. We've suffered to varying degrees. I just saw an article this morning talking about worldwide the suffering in Sudan and in Turkey and in Gaza and in Russia. And you just read this and there's overwhelming sense of like the world is just broken. So I think it's cognitive and it's experiential and emotional. Second is some part of the Christian response is, while we know why God allows evil as a whole, and I think Christianity offers the best response, I don't have an answer when somebody says to me, why did my uncle die of cancer? Why was I bullied as a kid? In many ways, we might not know in this lifetime responses to or reasons for specific acts of evil. And it's troubling today in our age of information, especially when we think we can answer everything, to realize there's certain questions we can't fully answer to our own satisfaction. And that's where trusting God comes in. There's probably a lot more reasons that, but that's two that come to mind.
Okay, and one of the I think that's an important what you've touched there because of the emotional response that is from a lot of people. And I did hear you say in one of your interviews that you do believe that the Christian worldview provides the best explanation. And so, is there any chance you could extrapolate on that a little bit? Why you think Christianity provides the best explanation, I guess, the best answer or understanding to the problem of evil?
So I would say a couple things as I answer this. There's the emotional problem of evil, and there's the intellectual problem of evil. I think Christianity best addresses both of those. Now, before I launch into it, we got to realize that the problem of evil and suffering is not just a problem or a challenge for Christianity. Every single worldview needs to make sense of why the world is broken, why people suffer, why there's just seemingly horrific things that happen nonstop in the world. So atheists have to have a worldview that makes sense of this. Hindus, Buddhists, Latter-day Saints, agnostics. So the question is not, can I tell you exactly why God allows evil in every instance? But as a whole, does it offer the most reasonable explanation, all things considered? That's why I'm a Christian, even though I can't dot every I and cross every T. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but emotively, there's a unique Christian response is that God has not just sent a prophet or a book or an angel, but we have a God who intimately understands our suffering and has stepped into it empathetically. This is Hebrews 4. We have a high priest who is tempted in every way and yet without sin. That's a part of the incarnation. And so when you and I suffer, sometimes we want people to just be there with us and be present and understand and hurt with us. That's a Christian response. Sometimes Christians jump in and say, well, read this verse and free will and, et cetera, without any empathy or compassion and make the issue worse. But Romans 12 says, be happy with those who are happy, be sad with those who are sad. A Christian response is to enter into somebody's suffering, to be present with them, to show empathy and care because they're beings made in the image of God. And there's also space in the Christian worldview for lament. I mean, read David, a man after God's own heart, saying things like, God, why have you abandoned me? Why do I hurt so bad? Lament helps us process evil and suffering. Now, a ton more could be said about that, but I think Christianity has the tools built within it that matches up with modern day psychology about how people can suffer well and best help others who suffer emotively. Now, intellectually, this is probably going to take up the rest of our conversation. And I don't know if you want me to just lay out the entire thing. I have extensive talks where I walk through this, but I would bring in certain things like God's desire to be in relationship with us, and he gives us free will and even the capacity to have a world in which we're different from the animals and we can have meaningful dialogue with one another and life choices requires that if God is going to allow us to love, he's got to allow us to hate and not love. If God is going to allow us to show compassion, he's got to allow us the freedom to not show compassion and to be cruel. So in part of what it means to be human and the experiment, although that's a loaded term, so to speak, I think God has made a world in which evil is a possibility and an actuality because of the kind of world that he made that I would argue is worth it as a whole. You're going to have things like evil. Now that opens up the door and doesn't begin to answer it. I'm not pretending that answers all of it, because of course we have natural evil, but that might be a starting.
Well, actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because what I like to do sometimes is go to some of the best skeptical arguments against Christian thought. And, one of the most renowned New Testament critics is Bart Ehrman. And he did a recent interview as well about this topic, and spoke about just in relation to the arguments or the defense of free will. So Christians will use, say, the free will in order to answer the problem of evil. And he has two things that he mentions on it. One of them is that the natural evil. So how does that actually explain natural disasters? Why would God allow that? So we've got tsunamis, we've got, floods in certain areas. So how does that account for natural evil?
So it's not meant to. So I think Bart Ehrman, obviously brilliant New Testament textual critic, wrote a book. I think the title was probably a decade ago, God's Problem. And he said that it was evil and suffering in the world that really hijacked his faith more than anything else. That's his big problem that I've heard him state in different settings. And so nobody argues that I'm aware of, I'm sure somebody does, that the idea that God has given us free will is what explains things like tsunamis and cancer and other natural evil. So that's just logically not relevant to the question of why there is natural evil. Now we could talk about that, but the response of free will can't be faulted for not answering another challenge that it's not meant to address. Now, the only way free will would come into play is if you have, well, I guess I would say a couple things. One is in original sin, if Adam and Eve had free will and chose to reject God, then there's natural consequences to the world in which we live as a result of their choices, the curse, so to speak, in original sin. So there's free will of the original couple, so to speak, but not each individual after that. Second, a lot of times natural disasters are brought on by human choice. Things are made worse. So I think of like the flood, I don't know how long it's been, maybe 15 plus years ago, that was in Louisiana, New Orleans. A lot of the suffering was profoundly exacerbated by just some of the lack of care by the government and individuals and human choice. We saw this in earthquakes in Haiti, far more damage there than an equivalent earthquake would happen, say in Florida, because of corrupt governments and free will. So bottom line, it's not meant to answer all natural suffering and evil. It's a piece of it that we could use to look at that more holistically.
Well, great answer. One of the comments that actually Bart made in this interview was that he believes naturalism provides a better explanation for natural evil, in that, insofar that the universe doesn't care about us. It's hostile in a lot of ways to humanity. So that would explain the natural evil. And so I found that perplexing in a variety of ways, in that if the universe doesn't care about us, and there's a lack of meaning, why would the suffering matter in the first place? So what do you think about that, about naturalism providing a better explanation for natural evil because the universe doesn't care about us?
If we assume naturalism and we look at certain, again, I don't know that I would use the term natural evil. We're using it for discussion, but
Yeah,
evil
yeah,
implies a certain intent.
of
But
course.
this is the way the conversation often happens. If we assume a naturalistic universe, then we can look at earthquakes and viruses and other forms of natural disaster and make sense of it. I don't deny that, but that's not my starting place. My starting place is not just natural evil, because evil is a corruption of something that's good. We have to ask deeper questions. All right, if we're talking about why natural evil has disasters and has gone bad, there's certain things that naturalism has to account for first that are a part of the larger equation. Namely, why is there something rather than nothing? Why are we in a universe that is so exquisitely fine-tuned for life? How do you
Mm,
get life from non-life when it's full of so much vast amounts of information, far more complex than anything our most sophisticated nanotechnology can begin to do today? How do you get consciousness from matter? How do you get objective right and wrong? So if we look at nature as a whole, yeah, like if you assume a naturalistic worldview, we can make sense of natural evil. But why assume that? I mean, it was Alvin Plantinga who said, he framed it this way, and hopefully I'm doing justice to the way he framed it. As I recall it, he said, on one side of like the scales, you have evil and suffering weighing against God. On the other side of the scales, you have everything else about nature, why there's a universe, fine tuning, the existence of consciousness. He gives like a dozen arguments and says the evidence for a creator so far outweighs evil when you look at it as a whole. And I think he's right about that. So whenever we talk about God and evil probably existing or not, some people will say, well, look at the natural world. Probably there's not a God because of some disaster that happened, natural or man-made. And I'd say, yeah, if we isolate that, it might feel that way. But why isolate that? We've got to explain the entirety of the universe and natural suffering and evil. And that's where I think naturalism woefully falls short.
it does. I guess from a presuppositional stance, you have to, even to account for suffering or evil, you have to presuppose a potential absolute standard or an objective source. It almost is as if that you have to presuppose the existence of God in order to argue against him. Something that naturalism's, it's hard to account for meaning, evil, and suffering in a naturalistic worldview. So I do think it is hard to rationalize. But with that said, with regards to the free will of humanity, and that we are free agents, so to speak, to do harm to one another in the world and cause suffering for others, that we play an active role in it. One of the things that is very interesting in the interview that Bart likes to ask Christians, or people, theists, so to speak, that have this worldview that we are actually the free agents causing it, and that as a result of that, that's one of the defenses against the problem of evil or suffering. He asks this person, do you believe that that there will be evil? Sorry, he goes, do you actually believe there's free will in heaven? And this person says yes. And then they say, do you believe there will be evil in heaven? They say no. And then he says, well, if it's possible to have a world with free will coexisting without any evil, why doesn't he do it already?
Mm.
What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, this is a great question. I would say a couple things. There are two basic responses I hear apologists give, and I believe that I've heard William Lane Craig give an answer to the effect of, when we get to heaven, we don't have the kind of free will that we have here and now. So we make a choice to follow God, repent or not, And then we're kind of sired into that choice in heaven and can no longer choose to do evil in the way that we can today. That's one live option that thinkers as brilliant as William Lane Craig defend, and then it would resolve the problem that he's talking about, if so. The other one that philosophers like J.P. Moreland, who's been a colleague and co-author with Bill Craig, and he's actually a colleague of mine at Biola, he argues that we do have free will in heaven. But right now, we'd say a couple things change. Number one, the environment changes. We live in a world in which there's temptation on the outside coming from people. And of course, as Christians, we would believe demonic influence at times is possible as well. But nonetheless, your external environment changes. But also our nature is completely transformed into one that is like Christ. And so the new creation has begun here. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians that we see through a glass darkly. But when we get to heaven, we see with clarity. And so an example might be, there's zero chance you're going to read a report that I take my son who just turned 12 and say, you know what, I'm going to throw him off a bridge and see how long he can survive in traffic. Like, just to use an extreme, jarring example. That is never, ever going to happen because of my love for my son. Even though technically I have the power and free will to do it, I'll never do that because it would harm someone so deeply that I love. I think we don't realize the depth of even little what we would call white lies and little deceptions, how profoundly they hurt our relationship with others, and how much profoundly they hurt God. So I think in part when we get to heaven, you could argue that we still have a kind of free will, but we see with such clarity that internally and externally, any kind of temptation is completely gone. So we just simply will not exercise that any more than I would do such a terrible thing to my son. I think that's a very reasonable response. Now, why doesn't God make that right now? Well, in part because I think to get to that state, I think there's a sense where we have to choose of our own volition, in a sense, to be with God, repent, turn away from sin, and have a deep recognition of our own sin, humble ourselves, and invite God to come in and transform us from the inside out and begin that process. You can't skip that stage and all of a sudden just have people as if they had chosen to be there, as if they had repented and desired to be with God and have free will and have sin. And I just don't buy that somebody can say, well, he's God, he can do anything. I go, okay. And I'm not saying Bart says this. I have no idea how he responds. But that response would be a cop-out. God has made beings with choice and is going to work within the system that he has created. And I don't think skipping that step makes any sense and is even possible, so to speak, for God to do.
I do like that answer. I was actually talking about it with my wife this morning, and I said, the idea of free will in heaven. I said I'm not sure, because I thought it was a great question. I was asking him, how would I answer this? And I thought to myself, I'm not sure if there would be free will in heaven in the sense that we have it here. It's almost as if in my own faith journey that I realized the more I try to align my will with that of God's will, the more I surrender, the ability to choose for myself, the more happiness and joy I encounter in walking or trying to align my life with the way God has actually asked me to live it. And I find that there is a natural cyclical nature to that. I do want more joy and I do want more happiness. I do want to partake in other people's joyful life as well and bring happiness to their life. And so there seems to be this cyclical nature to it that I just want to stay in God's will. And I think it becomes less about what I want, more about what God wants, because it ends up benefiting me and those around me. And I do want to see other people have happy experiences. So I do like that answer, and it kind of makes sense as well. I think we've got probably time for one more question,
Okay.
because I know we've booked you for a certain amount of time, and thank you for taking the time to do this. This is great because this is a difficult topic. It does sort of trouble quite a few people, and believers and skeptics alike. And so the idea that suffering, in terms of one of the defenses and one of the defenses to the problem of suffering within the Christian worldview, is the idea that suffering can bring about certain virtues, that allows for certain virtues to develop. One of the things that I think about why does God allow evil and suffering in the world, because he seems so much good seems to come out of it. My personal faith journey, I've had terrible things happen, but it led me to God in such a way that I'm grateful for that pain in a lot of ways. And I also think about the idea that the evil and the suffering that he allowed to take upon, say, Jesus' own body, what that would do to the world 2,000 years on would change the world like never before. So, so in terms of your understanding, why this idea about suffering bringing about certain virtues, what do you think about that?
I think this is a piece of a larger response to the problem of evil. I mentioned free will is only one piece. There's a
Mhm.
lot of pieces, what you might consider a more cumulative case, and we haven't gotten into all those, which is fine. But I think this is one, in some ways, obvious reason why God allows evil and suffering. I mean, it's really interesting, Matthew. When the day we're recording this, it was about a year ago, I started to feel just something wrong with my body. And I went through 3 months of the worst pain I have ever experienced. It was miserable, lying on my back for sometimes 3 to 4 hours, just literally taking a breath at a time, trying to get through the day, not knowing when this was going to end. And I remember feeling, I think I said to my wife and a friend, I said, I'm not in a position right now where I can thank God for this. It hurts so bad. And I was losing weight. I dropped down to 130 pounds. I'm normally 150 to 155. And I remember feeling like I can't thank God. I don't have the emotive ability to do so. But I prayed. I was like, God, give me the ability in due time to be able to understand why. Now, I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy, although some of the people I mentioned earlier causing the suffering in Sudan and in, different places in the world, maybe, but, I'm only halfway kidding. It was terrible. But I look back and I go, okay, I do see what God taught me through this, certainly humbled me in some ways, gave me a profound sense of just empathy for other people who suffer, not 3 months, but 3 years and 3 decades. It gave me an inkling of a deeper understanding, like you said, of what Christ went through. It in part reminded me, I'm 48 years old, and I'm like, okay, my time here is finite, and I got a taste of that.
Mm.
So when we want to grow, especially with our kids, it's never on our terms in the way we want it to happen, ever. It's always more painful, and I think that's what it takes. And so when that kind of suffering hits, I think God kind of gives us a choice. We can be like Job's family who says, why don't you just say, curse God and die? And I understand those emotions and those sentiments. Or we can take a moment and go, okay, I don't get it. It doesn't make sense. God, it hurts and I'm suffering. But I want to trust you. I want to draw closer to you. And then God works good out of the ashes and the brokenness and our hurt. Ultimately, that's a biblical truth. So I don't want to say this is the only answer to the problem of evil, because there's objections that could be raised against it. And we could take this issue further. But I think even non-Christians would recognize that it's through pain, it's through hurt, it's through adversity that we grow and we learn. That's a part of being finite human beings, and that is profoundly embedded within the Christian worldview. And I think it's in Hebrews, 13, that says, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who are trained by it. And I
Amen.
think that's right.
That's also, actually, I saw this meme the other day online of this guy as a young man, maybe through AI imagery. They took the same photo and aged him. You know, he's got scars, he's battered, he's bruised, but he's actually got a smile on his face. And this is what it is to actually be a Christian and have a Christian journey, is that it doesn't absolve you from pain or suffering, but you can actually learn to smile in the midst of it. You can learn to glorify God in the midst of the pain. And that's what that worldview does. It gives you that sense of hope. And actually, one of the things that I do when I think about, I assume you had nerve pain, right? In the back? Is that
Yeah,
some type
I'll
of
spare you the
disc?
details.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'll spare
But
you the details.
but
Let
yeah,
me say one thing. There's a difference between smiling in the midst of pain. Sometimes those memes can be, I'm hurting, smile, everything's great. One was 828. The point is, I think we can have trust in God, and we can have contentment and purpose and empathy that God suffers with us through it, and that God will use our suffering for good. We had our faculty training yesterday at Biola, where I teach, and one of the points that one of our president made was just to suffer well. When we suffer with purpose and meaning, it does show the wider world that we have a hope beyond this world. It's a testimony. So it doesn't mean, I know you're not implying this like, hey, I'm suffering, all is great, Jesus is with
yeah,
me.
yeah.
No, read the Psalms, man. People profoundly hurt and don't understand as much or even more maybe than non-Christians, because we know God could fix it if he wanted to, but that we have a contentment through that suffering and a purpose.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I think that's probably a good point to end the interview. I'd like to thank you for coming on and touch on this difficult topic. Everyone can find you at Sean McDowell on YouTube and on Instagram. And I know that you have your latest book, And the Stalemate, on seanmcdowell.org and also on Amazon. So we'll leave that in the link below in the description for people to find. Thank you so much for coming on.
I was expecting some tough questions, and you definitely delivered. Thanks for a good conversation.
Awesome. Thank you.